So, this week I've been talking about anxiety because I'm currently writing a book about the main character of the book. She struggles with panic attacks. She has lots of anxiety. And I think the year before last, if I'm not mistaken, I'm terrible with time. But anyway, kind of recently, I wrote another book about a character who has anxiety or issues with anxiety. And it's a middle grade book that's loosely based on Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. It's called Stuck at Camp Whatever. And so it's sort of like has the Pride and Prejudice storyline, kind of, sort of, but not really, except it involves tweens. So all of these kids, I think they're like 13. Yeah, they're 13 years old and they're at summer camp. And I switched the genders. Like in Pride and Prejudice, the character who's a little bit uptight is Mr. Darcy. So I made Mr. Darcy the girl. Her name is, I forgot her name. Sorry, it's just been so long since since I wrote this. Her name's Willa. Willa, and I think her last name might be Darcy. I can't remember. And Elizabeth in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the real book. In my version, it's this kid. His name is Benny. Okay. Whew, that felt very long-winded. I'm sorry. But my point is that anxiety comes into play in this little book because Willa, the girl, she's Mr. Darcy, she comes across as like rude and snobby and uptight to Benny, but she's none of those things. She's really down to earth and very sweet. It's just that she struggles with anxiety. Um, so I wanted to just briefly read a section um, to show how Willa's anxiety displays itself. And hopefully I have the right section chosen here. I'll go for it. Okay, this is chapter 7, so hopefully this makes sense because it's like the middle of the book. This is from Benny's perspective. Every chapter is different. Like one chapter is from Willa, the next will be from Benny, then Willa, then Benny, and this happens to be Benny's perspective. Rowing on the lake wasn't too bad. Zach and Misty pretended to sprain their arms to get out of rowing. Jimmy said he had asthma, which was true but non-applicable, and I flat out said I didn't feel like picking up even one oar, which left all of the rowing to Colin. It also completely went over Colin's head when we all started laughing about how creepy he was. We used a code name for him that Jimmy came up with, Creepster. It wasn't all that original, but it was funny, and we were laughing the entire time we were out on the water. The only thing that ruined it all was Willa. She hardly laughed, she just stared into space, too high and mighty to joke around with us. There were moments when I thought she was just sad, and that made me feel kind of bad. But then she'd look at me with those soul crushing eyes of hers, and I'd lose my sympathy. She wasn't sad, she was stuck up. At the shore, we stepped out of the rowboat, and creepy Colin clapped his hands for no apparent reason and loudly said, "Okay, head back to your cabins for 30 minutes of free time before lunch." "Yes, sir," Zack said, saluting the creepster and then running towards the cabins as he shouted over his shoulder, "First one back to the cabin gets to give me their dessert at lunch." "I don't think he understands how incentives work," Misty laughed. "Clearly," Jimmy said as he fell in stride beside Misty. It wasn't long before they lowered their voices and started a conversation that didn't seem to have room for a third person. I smiled to myself. Proud of him, I hung back behind the two of them as we headed back to camp. I wanted to give them plenty of space to talk. "Hey," Willa's voice sounded behind me, and I jumped in surprise. Too shocked to speak, I just watched her jog until she caught up with me. As she slowed down and began to walk beside me, I found myself overwhelmed. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Overwhelmed by a strange blend of emotions. I couldn't figure out if I was annoyed, nervous, or flattered. Also, why am I flattered? I don't want her attention. I forced myself to look straight ahead and say nothing while she walked beside me in silence. My feelings evened out and eventually became pure annoyance. Even when she's walking with me, she thinks she's too good to talk to me. So, she finally spoke, and her voice cracked like she'd just woken up from sleep. What's your last name? I glared at her for a moment and then said, Hick. She nodded. Oh, okay, mine's Darcy. For someone so smart, she sure doesn't understand sarcasm, because she had called him a hick earlier when she didn't think he could hear her. I rolled my eyes. I know, Willa, everyone knows your last name, and I'm pretty sure you know that. She looked at me questioningly. How would everyone know my last name? Like she doesn't know. I laughed. You're rich, and rich people get noticed. Oh, Willa turned red, and I gave her a second glance. It suddenly hit me that maybe she really didn't know that we all watched her every move. I felt bad for embarrassing her and admitted, my last name isn't Hick. I was joking. It's Gear. I can't even pronounce his name that I came up with. Gear. I'm sorry. It's Italian. Giramento. It means promise in Italian. Oh, Willis said again, sort of awkwardly. She nodded and remained silent for a moment before quietly adding, That's pretty. For some reason, this comment made me a little bit, just a tiny little bit happy. I guess it's always nice when anyone approves of something about you. It's also hard to spell, I said. Maybe that's why I do okay in English and grammar. Being 4 years old and learning to spell a name like Giuramento will really sharpen your skills. Willa smiled, and I noticed how much more relaxed and even prettier she looked when she smiled. I wish I knew how to make her smile all the time. I caught myself thinking this and wondered why my brain was malfunctioning. I'd already realized that, based on her behavior, Willa was a snob, and if there was one personality type I clashed with, it was the snooty, arrogant types. No matter how pretty their smiles were, a snob was a snob. Mom called them privileged, and though she didn't say much about it, I saw how those types treated her just because of the color of her skin. So I could put up with a lot, but brats who looked down on other people was where I drew a line in the sand and kept my distance. Willa had fallen into another Grand Canyon of silence. The only sounds in the vicinity were the continual chatter of Misty and Jimmy, who were a few feet ahead of us, and the noise of crunching leaves and twigs beneath our feet as we padded onward. Finally, Willa cleared her throat and said, So you never told me what kinds of books you like. What books are your favorites? I frowned, wondering why she was pretending to care as I slowly replied, Science fiction, like the Star Wars series and Ender's Game, Dune. Do you think you'd ever want to write a book like that yourself? She asked. I turned to her, my eyes narrowing. Will she look down on me for being nerdy if I admit that's exactly what I want to do? I decided to play it cool and shrug as I said, I don't know. Like I said earlier, I'm great at wrestling alligators. So maybe I could go to the school of hard knocks and major in that. Willa smiled again and looked down. It really is a pretty smile, I thought as I let myself watch her. It took a minute for me to tear my gaze away. As we moved ahead quietly, Jimmy turned around and shot me a look that said, What are you two talking about? I frowned and shrugged before glancing at Willa, who was still staring at the ground, like she was afraid of falling or something. It reminded me of the way Jimmy was at school. He was friendlier than Willa because he was a good person and not a self-centered female version of Darth Vader. But shyness overtook him when he was walking down the hallways or in the school cafeteria. So, to soothe himself, he'd keep his eyes on his phone. I wondered if Willow was trying to make herself feel better by looking at the ground instead of at the scenery or at me. This made me feel kind of bad for her. I hesitated and then said, You're not the best at small talk, are you? Willa blushed and spoke so softly I could barely hear her. Honestly, I hate it. I will stop there because my voice is being so weird today. But yeah, so that was part of my adaptation. No, that's not the right word. Part of my book, Stuck at Camp Whatever, which is loosely based on Prejudice by Jane Austen. I had a lot of fun writing that because I really, really love Jane Austen books, especially Pride and Prejudice. So it was fun to kind of like turn that story, her story, into like an altered version in a different era with different ages and different genders. That was fun. And also, I really related to Willa's character. I think we all do this sometimes. We are misunderstood because maybe anxiety or shyness or just being an awkward person makes people think that we're like stuck up or something that we're not. So, yeah, that's all for today. I hope you have a great day and a great week. Thanks for watching.